So next slide, please, Tom. So, as you know, I come to the Scrutiny and give annual updates on transport strategy and how we approach them. This is the 8th one from when we started this, so this is the final one to get all in that place, and it follows the same thread of the process we go through, which is what that slide is showing about understanding the background and the sort of analytical, technical elements of what's taken place, then engaging with the public about what they see as challenges, opportunities, things that are good to build upon, and then looking at those opportunities where we might want to intervene, drafting the vision around that, and then finalising the strategy, which is the step we're at here. Next slide, please. So engagement is a really key part of that. Like I said, there's a lot of information up there, but effectively, we haven't, as officers, gone off and done this by ourselves. This has been done, first of all, with a transport board, the Stamford Transport Board, of which Councillor Richard Davies is the chair, and Councillor Richard Cleaver sits on as well, who's here today. It has district and county members, officers, and has a lot of input, like all the transport boards. As part of that as well, we went out with public engagement events. So actually went out to the public for them to give their view at a number of places, and we got 512 completed surveys back, which is pretty positive actually. And there were a number of stakeholder events with people like National Highways and many others as well. Next slide, please. So the key things that came out of that, I won't read it verbatim on there, but what was really slightly different about the Stamford one compared to others is it wasn't necessarily about hard infrastructure improvements, junction improvements, big roundabouts and the likes. It was more that the themes for me, although they're out there, was about protecting what it is now, building the economy upon that, and providing alternative travel patterns, things like walking and cycling, bus travel, things like that. So it's slightly different to some of the other towns that we've completed the strategies in. Next slide, please. So these were the 4 main challenges that we've sort of gone through all the information, which broadly sort of outlines what I just said about focusing on the environment, so protecting what's there, and enabling the sustainable growth, which largely points towards Stamford North, but not in isolation, there's various others. Improving the access, about that's alternative, not in place of, but alternative options around walking and cycling. And then changing, because of the nature of being next to the A1, is the interaction between the A1 and freight and retail. Next slide. So I'm not going to be painful and read that out because it's in the report itself. But again, we've tried to pick up on those key features, which is about protecting the town's historic core and building in those travel choices, not taken away, but trying to give a more balanced choice of how people do want to access. So that's the sort of the vision that we've put forward. Next slide. So again, conscious of time, I'm just going to pick up on what we call the key pillars, so which aligns with the other strategies and the supporting interventions. I've cut short on the presentation on the strategic network enhancements, but that's effectively what we in the district and stakeholders, we can influence third parties like Network Rail, National Highways, others to try and do. It's not necessarily, well, it's almost certainly not on us to implement ourselves. So I'll pick on the key pillars. Next slide. So those are the 5. Again, support what I'm talking about, sort of walking, cycling, and then walking and pedestrian, then cycling, mobility hubs, local bus service improvement plans, which aligns with the BSIT work that Mike and Helen were talking about earlier, and then your more larger infrastructure and growth around the Stamford North. Next slide, please. I'll go through these quite quickly because I'm conscious they're individual schemes. And what I should say within these are proposals. They are not promises, maybe that's the word, or plans to deliver. This is what we could deliver in the area. And even within those they would need to be investigated about how much they might cost, what's the risk in delivering that, how long, what's the benefit that you get out of doing it. And also being open, some of these, by building, say, for example, wider footways and whatnot, you will take away road space. So you are having to balance back and forth. That's a careful balance to consider. But there's a number of walking and cycling improvements, from crossings to footway improvements through there. Next slide. Equally, a number of cycles, so about the softer side of things, so the higher packages, the supporting infrastructure, and then on the next slide, we get into more of the infrastructure, which could align with the pedestrian movements as well. So they could be one in the same, or they could be separate. And a lot of this will link to the potential Stamford North development too. Next slide. On to mobility hubs. So we've looked at, if you go on to the next one actually, Tom. We looked at sort of 3 locations. One with the Stamford North, which could be integrated into the actual development site that comes along. One is looking at more centralising the local bus, and then the other one is looking at more interchange with the rail facility. Again, principles of what people are saying and can be looked at. Huge amounts of information would need to go, or process would need to go through whether these are taken forward or not. Next slide. Next one covers the last 2. One is about the local bus service improvement plan. I'm not going to say what Mike and Helen did that they've already done far better than I will, but it's along those same things about providing more better frequency or better facilities. And then, as I've touched on, the Stamford North Link Road, making sure that it's not a it's a development that integrates with Stamford, doesn't sit separate to it. And then the next slide is just showing roughly where that road may go as the development. Almost there on the next slide. So this is more the supporting infrastructure. So this is more the sort of, I guess, the construction works, or the things that we could look at. And again, I do stress the could look at. There's a number of themes through there: EV park charging, speed limit reviews, parking packages, park and stride, and then the behavioural management. So if we just quickly go through, next slide. These are some of the EV charging hubs that some of these are being looked at by the Levi and the Levi 2 bid already as on street, but they could be developed further if there's an aspiration and like most of these things, where there's a business need and the reinforcement to the electricity network to support it. Next slide. There was a request in the local community about 20-mile speed limits, speed limit changes, reviews, again, would need to be considered in the whole rather than in isolation, and guidance coming out from central government on things like LTNs and things like that are up in the air. But there's certainly, there was a lot of noise around wanting to review those kind of elements around that, which again would probably link in with things like walking and cycling and providing the networks for that. Next slide. This one again, connected with that, was about reviewing parking. Some of that was about restricting parking or putting in residence parking zones to almost to stick to that carrot, to encourage alternative transport and things like that. And again, review of the on-street parking review. And I'm sure Councillor Cleaver would agree that there's probably, I know there's running separate with the District Council reviewing the parking arrangements around there as well. Next slide, almost there. So this was more the sort of the bread and butter, I guess, that some people, which was on the minority for this particular transport, which I agree with from an analytical perspective. But these are sort of junctions and traffic signal improvements that could be investigated into. But the benefit aren't necessarily groundbreaking compared to the alternative travel pattern reviews. And I think the next one is the last slide, which is looking at the supporting infrastructure. This is like park and stride. So again, going back to what the feedback was very much about, wanting to encourage the walking and cycling in the area, is about having areas to park on the outskirts and walk in, not just about bus travel and so forth. So I think that brings the presentation to a close. There's lots more information in the documents and so forth, but I just thought I'd try and pick out the key elements for discussion. So I'd invite any questions at this point.
Thank you for that, Sam. Thank you for presenting that good report. And I'm going to come to Councillor Richard Cleaver now as the local member, not a member of the committee, but is asked to speak. So I'll give you your 3 minutes at the start of the debate. Over to you, Councillor Cleaver.
Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to address the committee on this item, the Stamford's transport strategy, which is of great importance to the residents and businesses in my Stamford West division. First of all, I'd like to thank our council officers, both in the public engagement team and in the transport and highways teams, for the highly professional and thorough work they've done in putting the strategy together. I hope the committee will formally record and pass on my thanks. I'm very pleased to see that we've produced a strategy which is so thorough and so comprehensive. It covers all the issues: road, rail, cars, lorries, buses, cyclists, pedestrians, mobility buggies, EV charging, school travel, mobility hubs, congestion, parking, road safety, accessibility, future-proofing and enhancing choice and prioritising active travel, etc., etc. And it does not shy away from mentioning the difficult and controversial issues either. It doesn't have all the answers, but it does ask all the questions and commit to coming up with answers through appropriate assessments, which is good. I'm a great believer in open, evidence-based decision-making. The strategy isn't prescriptive, it's enabling. I think we all see the constant arguments of what are crudely labelled as the pro-car faction and the anti-car faction, which is fine. I always welcome debate. One of the undertones of this strategy is that doing nothing is not an option, and I agree with that. So we mustn't shy away from taking action for fear of upsetting one faction or another. But I truly believe that we can come up with actions from this strategy which will help Stamford to thrive more, whilst improving the quality of life of its residents and improving the attractiveness of the urban environment, and unite most, if not all, sides of the debate as well. And this belief was bolstered by a representation I received only 2 days ago from the Stamford Civic Society, which expressed support for many, many aspects of this strategy. In conclusion, I'd just like to gently lobby the committee on 2 issues which come out in the strategy. The first is improvements to rail services. As a council, LCC has not, I believe, lobbied strongly enough for improved rail services across the county, and I hope that this will improve. Second, the strategy speaks of investigating a number of 20-mile-an-hour zones, which Sam has alluded to. And I hope that LCC will adopt a sensible and measured policy which will enable such schemes to be requested and adopted, not just in Stamford, but where appropriate in towns and villages county-wide. Again, thank you very much for allowing me to come and speak.